Good evening, everybody. It's meteorologist Gabriel Krapp here, back with another update. Now, today we're going to be looking at November, the second half of November in particular, and we're taking a look at what you can expect for the second half of November, more specifically in the northeastern United States, but also in the country as a whole. So, starting off, this is currently about today, 7 p.m. local time in the eastern United States on the 9th of November, which is going to be today, Wednesday, 9th of November. We see Hurricane Nicole as it's nearing the eastern coast of Florida. We see another low pressure system, 993 millibars, located over central Colorado with snow across the Rocky Mountains and a little bit of rain into Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the upper peninsula of Michigan, as long as well as a very well defined eastern ridge and western trough. I'm going to move this forward about 4 frames, and throughout that time, we can see a very large snowstorm is taking effect across much of the Dakotas and northern Minnesota. We see Hurricane Nicole has made landfall in Florida and is now headed towards the eastern coast the northern coast of Florida and is now moving into Alabama and Georgia. We also see a trailing cold front here going all the way from Texas to Minnesota and colder air filtering in behind that with a ridge starting to build in the southwestern United States. It remains warm in the east. If I bring this out 4 more frames, there is continuing to be rain, especially in the northeast as well as the interior northeast. A little bit of a coastal low developing there as well. Very, very cold air behind there with more of a central United States ridge, I would say. Trough, sorry, and there is a little bit of ridging going on in the southwest is remaining dry. It's also some thunderstorms across Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, as well as into Mississippi. But the bulk of the storminess is over the eastern half of the country at this point. Moving on further, move into a little bit of a lull. There is a low pressure system moving into California, however, it's extremely weak and it's not expected to produce much of an impact. Once the cold air finally reaches the eastern coast of the United States, this is about the 15th of November, so this will be next Tuesday. That very weak low pressure system that we saw that moved onto the California coast this weekend, Saturday, Sunday, is now starting to develop into a more significant winter storm spread across Texas and Oklahoma. It's also moving into Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, before fizzling out. After that, we see another winter storm threat starting to emerge around the 18th of November. So, two back to back storms. One that produces snow across northern western Texas, Oklahoma, and into southeastern Kansas, Missouri, northwestern Arkansas, and a little bit into the southern Great Lakes region before it fizzles out. And then we see a second storm move in a little bit further east this time with the band of snow starting in sort of Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, north of Virginia, D.C. areas, and that moves offshore pretty quickly as well. We see a very, very cold air mass moving into the central and eastern United States. The jet stream sort of would come in at this point through Montana, down towards the central Midwest, and then up towards the eastern seaboard and straight out just south of Massachusetts. We see there is a storm that tries to take shape in the southeast, but that second piece of energy is too fast of it. The piece that's holding the trough together, that 992 millibar low pressure system over Quebec, is too fast. So that storm races off the coast before it has any chance of developing. And then we see a little bit more wintry weather, maybe a clipper type system moving to the northeast, but overall dry United States, but definitely a colder United States, with even the 510 and 504 lines making an appearance throughout the far northern portions of the eastern United States. You also notice that 1041 Arctic high pressure system over Minnesota. That's what's fueling this very, very cold air into the east. And this is as about Friday the 25th of November, I would say. Now we're going to take a look a bit more at the temperatures. So this is going to be your 2 meter temperature shaded. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move in and focus a little bit more on the northeastern United States at this point. So this is currently right now at about 7 p.m. And you can see it's particularly cold across the eastern United States. Expected to frost in a lot of locations away from the immediately coastline tonight into Pennsylvania, upstate New York, and New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine. It's expected to freeze as well. Blue is indicative of freezing. We see a warm up with that storm this weekend, Hurricane Nicole's remnants, and it's in the mid 60s. Then we see a reinforcing shot of cold air behind it. Notice the temperature gradient. This is as of Sunday morning. You can see that there are temperatures in the 20s as far southwest as Nashville, but it's remaining in the upper 40s in eastern Maine. That, however, will soon change, and that cold air will filter even further east towards the coast, almost reaching the coast with widespread 20s across much of New England, especially New York, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. But even as far south as, let's say, western Virginia, the Blue Ridge Mountains, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh, as well as seeing cold air, and Michigan. That cold air centered over the eastern United States. It weakens a little bit, and then we see another reinforcing shot of cold air around the 19th of November. Again, that's another time when I saw on a highlighted another possibility of a storm occurring in the Northeast at that time. We see widespread cold shots. Notice very, very significant cold around the mountains of West Virginia. Very significant cold across the Catskills, the Blue White Mountains, the Green White Mountains, northern Maine. And then that cold air pretty much just sticks around. Maybe a slight warm up to about 50 degrees. Then around the 21st of November, we get very significant cold taking over all of the eastern United States. And that pretty much stays with us until the end of the forecast period when it gets even sharply colder. Although this is more of a north south gradient at this point with temperatures as low as, 0 degrees for parts of northwestern Maine. Definite plenty of teens across much of northern New Hampshire, northwestern Vermont, although even coming into portions of upstate New York, northwestern Pennsylvania. However, the coastline does remain a little bit warmer at this point, even Nova Scotia getting into those freezing temperatures. But notice that very, very cold air mass over Quebec. That's going to be important, as the location of that will determine not only how deep that cold gets for the eastern United States, but also whether that allows the storms to ride up the coast or whether they just go straight out to sea and fizzle out like we saw earlier on the precipitation maps. And you might be wondering, 20 degrees doesn't sound particularly bad. How far below our normal is that? Well, in terms of our normals, we can take a look a little bit at our temperature anomaly maps. And this is just telling you how far in degrees Celsius above or below your normal temperature it will be on a given frame. Now, if I bring this all the way back to now, this is about now, and this is tonight. It's gonna be a little bit colder across the east, but generally a ridge in the east, and that kind of stays with above normal temperatures for a couple of days, especially when that storm, Hurricane Nicole remnants come in, and it kind of cools down to about normal to slightly below normal levels as of Monday before the cold really sets in. And notice those are like 4 to 6 degrees Celsius. That's 10 degrees below your normal. It kind of gets a little bit of a warm up, still remaining cold for much of the east, kind of a mixture at this point, with some areas above normal, some areas below normal, 16th, 17th. Then the more significant cold will set in. It's very, very cold compared to your average. Don't forget, this isn't actually actual temperatures. This is just compared to your normal temperature. It might be 20 degrees normal in northern Maine, but average is 20. But it might be 50 degrees average in West Virginia, but it's also 20. So just keep that in mind. These are anomalies, meaning it's more likely to be representative of how far from your normal on a given frame your temperature is. We take this out further, those purples start showing up for the Northeast. And this is interesting as the purples indicate temperatures that are closer to 10, 12 Celsius below normal. That's up to 20 degrees below normal for a lot of New England, a lot of the mountainous regions, especially, as well as northern New York, all of upstate New York, including Long Island. But we see a little bit of a ridge holding on for southeastern Virginia, Maryland, southern New Jersey, DC area. However, we see the cold air continuing across the Blue Ridge Mountains and into the Great Lakes. I'm going to zoom out once again to the contiguous United States. Just to give you an idea. This is by the time we reach the 25th of November. So this is the day after Thanksgiving. And this is our early morning the day after Thanksgiving. Notice where the core of the cold is. There's kind of two pockets of that significant cold. One is across northern Minnesota into North Dakota, and the other pocket is kind of over the northeastern United States, and those pockets are expected to continue. The West is kind of a mix, but more warm than cold can be expected across the West. And this model does get a little bit confused. It's like you have a little ridge in the center, a cold in around it, and then a bit of like a complete mess in the West. It doesn't quite understand, the significance of, exactly what temperature it's going to be. But we can see overall the Northeast is heading into a significantly colder pattern than what we've been seeing over the past couple days. If I just go back a couple of days, this will be as of Sunday. Look at how hot we were on Sunday. 12 to 16 degrees Celsius above our normal. That is 30 degrees Fahrenheit above our average temperature. That is a very significant temperature anomaly. But notice how that quickly fades away and we get back to more average, a little bit of warmth here for during that hurricane, remnants passing through the region, but that quickly fades away and we get into locked into pretty much colder pattern in the eastern United States for much of the rest of the forecast frames. The West is an interesting mixed bag as it tries to get warmer in the Southwest. It doesn't exactly make it. The West, I think, will stay pretty zonal. Again, some warmth popping up perhaps for the Southwest, the coastal regions, as well as the interior Rockies, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah. Those regions would see some colder than normal temperatures just because they're at higher mountaintops. But also, I think, overall, the high level region, the West, will persist. And you can pretty much see this on this. There's a kind of a region in the West, a little bit of a southeast ridge, but then cold north central and northeast, and that just is expected to persist throughout the rest of the forecast frames. I'm going to go to the ensemble GEFS model. This is very interesting as this tells you not just this is the 2 meter temperature anomaly 5 day averages. So this is period day 6 to 10. And this is interesting to note. This is for days 1 to 5. Again, this is the total of days 6 to 10. So it's valid from the 14th of November to the 19th of November. And it looks like the entire country is under colder than normal temperatures. And the Northeast, of course, is getting out of those warmer than normal temperatures, which have been plaguing the area for quite a few days now. But the majority of the cold is really centered over those northern plain states and the west. However, by the time we get to the 19th of November, we see that cold making its way more into the east, and the west kind of moderates a little bit from that significant cold to more of just a neutral pattern. Again, this model tends to favor cold a little bit, the GEFS. It's not much different if you look at the EPS model. Although this does go out to days, 6 to 10, and then days 7 to 11, 8 to 12, 9 to 13, and 14, 11 to 15, basically showing cold across the entire country, with the exception of the very first couple of frames, which show that warmth leaving the Northeast, just because there's a little bit of lag in terms of when the warmth actually does leave the Northeast and what's felt at the surface. However, we also see it's becoming to be a bit more warm. I wouldn't necessarily say warm. I'd say more zonal and flat ridge, more ridge-like across the west. But we see the west still trying to hold on to that cold air, which does make sense given the pattern that I just showed you. I want to briefly touch on current storms. Tropical Storm Nicole, which is currently located just off the Florida coast and is expected to make landfall as a hurricane sometime tonight. It's not expected to reach hurricane status. In terms of where it will track, the center of it will track, likely will be right over the northeastern United States, which means parts of southeastern Massachusetts, the coastal regions of down east Maine, New York City, on southward will receive a fair bit of wind, and parts northwest of the storm track. So much of Massachusetts, upstate New York, much of New England, Pennsylvania, Virginia will see a lot more rain. And that follows a very consistent pattern where you see rain on the northwestern flank of the storm, and you see sort of bit more of that wind component on the eastern side of the storm. I'm going to pull up the short range 3 day model just to put this into perspective a little bit. So as that storm moves up, you can see the rain is more centered towards the western half of the storm as it moves up into northern Florida. This model does have a slight eastern bias towards it, but I think in the context of this, there is also a gap in the rain, but then that rain does come to the northeast as well. It also starts out as a little bit of wintry mixed precipitation for northern Maine and also ends at a little bit of wintry precipitation for the Great Lakes region, which is also another interesting thing to note. This model also has those two storms merging faster than is currently expected. It's not impossible for that to happen either. I'm just going to show you another short range model that goes out, 84 hours or so, 3.5 days, which shows the rain kind of moving in a few waves. This one's a bit more eastern based, but the whole principle is the same. If I give you the total accumulating precipitation, anywhere between a half an inch and let's say 2 inches of rain is in the blue, and then anything over 2 inches is kind of in that purplish color. Less than half an inch, you're in the greens. The global forecast system model is kind of expecting the greatest rain wet risk to be further west of the track, which I do agree with. I also think that the greatest precipitation will also be across the north central and northeastern United States, but you can clearly see where this storm's going to track. I can show you the Canadian model as well, which is an interesting outlier, as it kind of has it going really far west and weakening a little bit, which is not what's expected to happen. ICON model, same story, western rains, eastern winds. I can touch on the wind component some other time, but in terms of, we can even take a look at the 32-kilometer model, which is interesting because this model shows kind of the high level scenario. So we get a couple rounds of rain, and this is where it's kind of showing how that trough across the Great Lakes is, of course, negatively tilted, which means that as it moves into the northeast, had there been a storm that had gone a little bit slower, that low pressure would not able to form, and we would have gotten a snowstorm. But I think it's a little bit too early in the season for that to happen anyway. In terms of, overall forecast pattern over the next 10 to 15 days, I think we're going to see cold in the east. I'm going to see warm in the west. If I move on for the full forecast range, 240 hours, 10 days, you could expect anywhere from, 2 to 3 inches of rain across much of the east and southeast, lesser amounts elsewhere, except for the north central United States, including the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin. There you can see a bit more precipitation, a little bit more precipitation across the eastern plains as well, and perhaps into northwestern California. That's questionable with that storm moving across that kind of produces that ripple effect across Texas. That's a little bit questionable as to how much precipitation actually produces. This model is kind of underdoing it a little bit. The GFS model is the same way. It's again favoring the east, but less favoring the west, which overall does imply a colder and wetter east and a warmer and drier west. Not something that's welcome this time of year, as the west is already dealing with significant drought. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. Please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more weather updates to come. And I'll see you next Wednesday. Have a nice evening. Bye.